Towards the end of the 18th century, a man was arrested at the English border. He carried neither weapons nor stolen valuables, and yet he faced a punishment that could send him to a penal colony for up to 7 years. His offense seems almost absurd today. Centuries later, somewhere a student pulls a pencil from a drawer, jots down a few notes, and gives it no further thought. Yet the material that leaves those marks on paper once belonged to the most valuable raw materials in Europe. What kind of material was it if a government was willing to guard it with weapons? Long before the pencil, it was difficult to leave any mark on paper at all. An artist could not simply sit down and draw. First, the paper had to be prepared. Finely ground bone ash was carefully applied to the surface, leaving behind a rough layer just thin enough to hold metal. The artist drew with a silver point, or more precisely with a thin silver rod that was slowly pulled across the prepared sheet. The lines were beautiful, sharp, precise, and permanent. Permanent. That was exactly the problem. There was no eraser. A mistake remained forever. If someone drew a nose too large, they either had to live with it or start over. Every misplaced line became part of the final work. For centuries, that was the price of leaving marks on paper. Then a storm changed everything. In a quiet English valley called Borrowdale, a powerful gust uprooted an ash tree. Beneath its roots, shepherds discovered a black, soft substance that left stains on everything it touched. At first, they used the material to mark their sheep, but eventually, someone noticed that the same marks also remained visible on paper. And then the discovery took a direction that nobody in the fields of Borrowdale could have foreseen. At some point, the material no longer ended up on sheep's wool or paper, but in the workshops of English artillerymen. There, it turned out that it could improve the production of cannonballs. The balls became more uniform, flew farther, and struck more reliably than before. With that, the black substance was no longer a local curiosity. It had become a military advantage, with no sheep involved. The material was exceptionally pure graphite, and England possessed the only known deposit of this quality on Earth. Ordinary graphite was by no means rare at the time. Graphite deposits had also been discovered in other parts of Europe, but almost everywhere the same problem appeared. The material was mixed with rock, sand, or other impurities and broke apart easily. The graphite from Borrowdale behaved differently. Some pieces could be removed from the ground, almost in their natural form. They were so pure that craftsmen could cut them directly without first processing them extensively. To the people of that era, it seemed almost like a miracle. No one knew exactly why this particular valley produced a material so different from nearly everything found elsewhere. Over time, its reputation spread far beyond England. Merchants, craftsmen, and scholars searched for ways to obtain the rare resource. People no longer wanted just any substitute. They wanted this exact material. The greater its reputation became, the harder it was for the Crown to maintain control over it. Because a monopoly has a strange characteristic. It does not merely make a resource valuable, it makes it famous. And once something becomes famous, people begin searching for ways to get it, at any cost. The Crown acted quickly. The valley was guarded, access was restricted, and graphite production was placed under royal control. From that point on, only as much material was released as the government considered appropriate. This artificial scarcity produced the desired effect. While demand continued to rise, supply remained tightly limited, causing the price of graphite to climb from £18 per tonne to nearly £4,000 within just a few decades. Most villagers were not even allowed to touch it, but the more valuable graphite became, the greater the temptation to smuggle some of it out of the mine. One miner developed a simple method for doing so. Hidden beneath his heel was a piece of graphite, barely larger than a thumb, carefully wrapped in cloth and concealed beneath a false sole. Between the shaft and the exit gate lay only 40 meters, yet on that short distance it was decided whether he would lose his livelihood or earn enough money to support his family for weeks. Soon, he was no longer alone. Individual smuggling attempts evolved into a hidden network stretching across the entire valley. Graphite disappeared inside loaves of bread, was sewn into clothing, or transported in boots. More and more families became involved, even as the Crown increased the penalties. The smuggling continued nonetheless, because on the other side of the checkpoints, there were always people waiting who were willing to pay large sums for the material. The control became so extensive that even workers were searched after every shift. At times, supervisors stood at the mine exits with loaded weapons. Some entrances led through small guardhouses that every worker had to pass through. There, bags, clothing, and tools were inspected. The measures seemed almost excessive, but from the Crown's perspective, they were necessary. The value of graphite had risen so dramatically that armed raids on the site had become a genuine problem. In 1752, Parliament even passed a law that made unauthorized entry into the graphite mines a serious crime. For a material that millions of people would later know simply as the core of a pencil, it was a remarkable development. For years, small amounts of the material left England through routes the Crown could never fully control. But with every piece of graphite, not only did a valuable resource reach foreign countries, but also the opportunity to study it. In workshops and laboratories across mainland Europe, craftsmen tried to understand what made the English material so special. And because of that, a question eventually emerged that would prove more dangerous to England than any smuggler. What if England's greatest advantage was not the graphite itself, but the fact that the world believed it was irreplaceable? Then the situation changed abruptly. While England continued benefiting from the graphite of Borrowdale, France found itself facing a problem. As it went to war with Great Britain at the end of the 18th century, the British Navy blockaded French ports and disrupted vital trade connections. Suddenly, the resource on which engineers, cartographers and military officers depended was scarcely available. For France, this was more than an economic inconvenience. Maps had to be drawn, construction projects had to be planned, and military operations had to be prepared. Yet the material that made all these tasks easier sat on the other side of a blockade. The search for a solution eventually led to an inventor named Nicolas-Jacques. His starting position was anything but promising. He had neither the famous graphite from Borrowdale nor a comparable deposit. Instead, he worked with an inferior and heavily contaminated variety that the English ignored. What he also had was ordinary clay. Okay, that is not exactly the kind of material from which people normally solve a national problem. But Conté began experimenting. He ground the graphite into a fine powder, mixed it with clay and water, shaped the mixture into thin rods, and then fired them at high temperatures. What emerged from the furnace threatened the monopoly England had built over generations. A mixture of inferior graphite and ordinary clay had begun replacing something that had previously been protected by guards. Conté had solved a problem that many considered impossible. For the first time, the quality of a pencil no longer depended solely on the purity of a rare raw material. By adjusting the ratio of graphite to clay, the hardness of the core could be controlled deliberately. A property that had once been dictated by nature could now be manufactured by human beings. With that, an advantage England had built over centuries began to disappear. When the famous Borrowdale deposits declined, the world did not panic. It did not need to, because Conté's method had already taken the decisive step. The modern pencil had long since been created, and the remarkable thing is that it did not emerge despite the scarcity. It emerged because of it. The man arrested at the English border knew nothing about this. Nothing about the fact that England's greatest advantage had never truly been in a valley, and nothing about the fact that every piece of graphite crossing the border weakened the monopoly a little more. The real change did not begin in the mine. It began the moment people were forced to live without it. If a pencil was once valuable enough to arrest people and guard mines with weapons, what ordinary things surround us today whose true significance we still do not understand?